I've been using YouTube since 2007, and starting around 2008, I started uploading my first videos to the website. In 2011, I started doing film analysis, and in 2013, I started this current channel, Malmrose Projects, which I intended to use as a more serious channel. I was very active at first in 2013 when I first started, but by 2014 I had become burned out and the channel lay dormant for over a full year before I returned in late 2015 and started making videos again. My model has always been to make videos whenever I can, and how active my channel was from 2013 to 2016 does reflect this, for better or worse. In 2017, I resolved to try to turn the channel around into something that made regular content and put a lot more work into the videos. By the end of 2017, I do feel that I've accomplished that, but I was well aware for quite a while that there would be something amiss. So in June of 2017, I came out as trans and non-binary on my channel. I came out long before that privately, as far back as late 2014, but I kept it hidden from my channel for a few reasons. The first is because I never felt it was going to become relevant. Since I primarily analyze media, it seemed like it would bring too much attention toward myself and away from the content of my videos to mention it. Who I was simply wasn't relevant to my content up to a certain point. Second is because I don't really feel that my private life was anyone's concern. I haven't talked about most of my experiences in life because they don't inform my videos all too much, or at least they didn't. By the time I had made my analysis on The Shining, it was starting to become clear that this wasn't going to continue being true. My analysis of media started to take a more explicitly sociological angle. I switched my major from film to sociology. My career trajectory changed, and with it, my identity actually became really relevant to a lot of analytical things I wanted to discuss. So when it first became too relevant to avoid, I came out, specifically in my Debunking Transphobia video, a video I had wanted to make for some time. Since then, things have changed pretty dramatically both in terms of my content and my experiences with YouTube. Part of this is coincidence. The social climate of YouTube has changed pretty significantly in the past 3 or so years, with a loud swing towards far right-wing rhetoric. But another part of that is the position that I found myself in within the last year, and this is where we get into the third reason of why I avoided coming out: harassment. Harassment on YouTube has been a problem since YouTube has been a website, but since I came out, I saw a massive upswing in the amount of harassment I received. Part of this is based on ideological differences. A lot of people simply don't agree with my views, and I didn't expect them to. But further than this, a large bulk of it is based in something a lot more personal. Me being non-binary has led to a daily level of people making any number of remarks, some hilariously tone-deaf, others obnoxious yet petty, and others still being almost unsettling in how hateful or even aggressive they can be. On a personal level, the harassment I've dealt with bothers me almost not at all. It takes no emotional energy to read people's comments, and no matter of disagreement, vitriol, or hate has affected my willingness to make videos about whatever I feel best making. Rather, the harassment fascinates me, because as someone who has interest in becoming a sociologist someday, the aspiring sociologist in me sees patterns and connects dots and weaves a thread between the bulk of these comments, and I'm fascinated by what these comments have to say beyond just the content within them, but what their comments imply about YouTube harassers and the way they think. This is why I've decided to make this video. I want to use the comments I've received as a sort of representative sample of anti-left, anti-trans, anti-queer, and far-right rhetoric that comes from YouTube harassers. I want to highlight the sheer volume of harassment that a trans YouTuber faces, what that harassment looks like, and how severe it can get. I want to help shed some light on it rather than just sweeping it under the rug or ignoring it, because I feel that it's a cheap and easy solution for people with privilege to push our own marginalization back onto us by treating it as our individual responsibility to deal with the harassment we receive. People don't realize that this helps create barriers to entry for marginalized voices online, because we can't individually mitigate harassment except by simply not being visible or avoiding having our voices heard at all. If we decide to treat this issue as the responsibility of the sole individual who experiences harassment to handle it by themselves, we risk creating a situation in which only people with privilege are given a welcome seat at the table of discussions that happen in visible online spaces. The fact that I only have 6,000 subscribers, and yet I've gotten the severe degree of harassers that I've seen and within such a short space of time, showcases that simply being trans and having even the most remote left-wing sympathies renders being a content creator way more difficult than it needs to be. As someone who wants to dedicate a lot of my efforts towards calling attention to problems that affect marginalized people in online spaces, I'm using the comments I've received hopefully as a jumping off point for a bigger conversation about what needs to be done to address this kind of issue that is faced not only by me, but by many marginalized voices online, including those who have tried their hand at being heard and those who have avoided being heard for fear of the kinds of harassment that we receive. Harassment isn't apolitical. It isn't universal in its targets, intensity, or intent, and I hope to use the comments on my videos to demonstrate what harassers are saying, how they appear to think, and what we can do about addressing these kinds of people. The obvious short answer would be to block them or to not engage, but I do hope that by the end of this video I'll have a more interesting takeaway than just that. So let's travel down the rabbit hole of YouTube harassers, shall we? The way I tallied the harassment on my videos is that I started from my video on The Shining and worked from there. I read all of the comments up until the most recent videos, saving comments that I felt were over the line. For the record, I differentiated harassers from critics. People who simply disagreed with my reasoning or the points I said or the conclusions I came to weren't included, though there were plenty of them. I only included people who crossed the line into saying something overtly antagonistic or problematic. I specifically made notes of any examples of misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, non sequiturs, and ad hominems, and direct or indirect threats against myself. Based on that, I collected about 80 hate comments that were overt enough to consider. I tried to categorize them, but it was a bit difficult because there were a lot of instances of people having a mix, with plenty of comments being both transphobic and racist, or both racist and conspiratorial, with some just being a free-for-all of harassing language hitting every mark. That said, by and large, the most prevalent form of bigotry was transphobia, with 42 of the comments being transphobic either explicitly or implicitly. It's worth noting that while I have a video explicitly addressing transphobia, the video that had the most instances of transphobic rhetoric was my video on The Shining, which is a video I put out before I even came out on my channel, and there's zero mentioning of trans people in the video, and I think that's pretty telling about how people approach conversation on YouTube. A very low number were directly threatening, with only 6 comments antagonizing me so overtly. One of them willingly acknowledged that he's a Nazi after telling me I need to be put in the gas chamber. So yeah, fuck that guy. It's worth noting that this is only on my own videos and only on YouTube. I've encountered a few harassers elsewhere online, including on my Twitter, and honestly the harassers on Twitter tended more towards concern trolling and blanket anti-feminist or transphobic arguments like "you're mentally ill." 6 may seem like a small amount, but it'd be a low bar to set if we're going to assume that the ideal situation is one in which a trans person only gets threatened with the gas chamber some of the time. I was a bit surprised at how low the amount of harassment was compared to what it could have been, but it could still be a lot better. I make this video now at around 6,400 subscribers, so if I were to reach 10,000 or 20,000, or if I were to get more regular viewership, would the rate of harassment go up or down? I would expect it to go up given that the rate of harassment has definitely increased since I came out. I may keep track going into the future to see how it compares to now. One thing that's important to note is that the harassment was very often irrelevant. By far the video with the highest amount of harassers was my video on The Shining, which has less views than my video on Xavier, yet has more harassers. In my Shining video, I didn't even say I was trans, and yet the transphobic harassment was most frequent in that comment section. I found this telling because while a lot of people did engage with the content at hand, a lot of people were more interested in going after me as a person and finding some way to invalidate the basic potential for my perspective to hold any weight. If they can call me mentally ill or a tranny or some other sort of awful thing, it makes it so that they don't have to engage with what I said. And this isn't reading into what people say. I do respond to these harassers sometimes and try to redirect the conversation to the topic at hand, which is supposed to be an analysis of The Shining, but instead, harassers very often default back to finding some way to bring it back to my character. Sometimes, people would just make things up altogether, like one guy claiming I was Jewish on my gaming culture videos. Other times they'd take things that I did say way too far, like being incapable of hearing the word cisgender in my Shining video without having to rage about it in the comments. Most of the time, though, the premise was the same. By virtue of simply existing the way I do, any single moment where I say something that they disagree with was a flimsy excuse to denigrate me based on some misogynistic, homophobic, or transphobic logic. Repeatedly, people mentioned having to shut the video off almost immediately after I said something they disagreed with, usually something that was vaguely left-wing in nature. This is true of those who I didn't qualify as harassers too. Critics in general mentioned having to turn the video off quickly after I said something they disagreed with politically. The difference between a critic and a harasser in this case was whether or not they'd then proceed to call me a slur or insinuate some fundamental incapability on my part due to being trans or feminine or woman or a feminist. That's more than ideological disagreement. It's harassment. It's sad that I had written more categories than I had received. I tried to make a note of any comments that were ad hominem attacks on me but weren't in some way transphobic or misogynistic or homophobic. I got one. Only one comment decided to attack me for a reason other than gender-based bigotry. Another thing worth noting is that the comments that were harassing were usually the first thing said, not something that happened with time with replies. Some people who I replied to who were initially a bit more hostile were a bit more lenient after saying that I wasn't particularly antagonistic when I spoke with them directly. Those people weren't counted as harassers, of course, but the ones who did harass me didn't escalate. That was always the starting point. A few people would drag it into replies to other comments or to my own replies to other users. The ones who repeatedly antagonized me seemingly as often as they could were not nearly as prevalent as one-time commenters who said some bigoted thing and then left the video alone, which tells me that at the very least, most people aren't preoccupied with harassing one specific person, so props to them for that. When I look at the volume of the comments per video, it's definitely the case that the more popular videos have a higher number of comments, and that's fine. What fascinates me most is trying to figure out why I got more hate comments on my Shining video than my Xavier video, even though the Xavier video has 20,000 more views at this point in time. My best guess is that the two pieces of media attract slightly different audiences. The Shining in particular is a film with a very specific audience. A frequent comment on my Shining video was that I didn't get enough into the satanic, New World Order, or faked moon landing messages. It should be obvious that the audience I'm referring to are conspiracy theorists. The Shining has been one of the most analyzed films ever, and a big reason why is because, with the advent of the internet and online self-published film analysis, there's been a number of people who have cropped up who have argued all sorts of different interpretations for the film. Unfortunately, the ones that have caught on the most have been the ones that argue that it reveals some sort of conspiracy theory on the part of Stanley Kubrick. My own video avoided this for what I would hope are obvious reasons. With those conspiracies come anti-Semitic undertones, with the Zionist conspiracy tying directly to Stanley Kubrick's Jewish heritage. Zionist conspiracies also have ties to far-right ideology, especially Nazism, but not exclusively so. So I feel like the harassment increase from The Shining has to do with The Shining having a larger audience of far-right viewers than that of Xavier, a show that was not nearly as well known and didn't cultivate such an audience. Naturally, even before I came out as trans, my softer and somewhat more androgynous voice would lead to far-right assholes saying either misogynistic comments under the assumption that I was a woman, or homophobic and transphobic comments under the assumption that I was a man. And that could be a bit of conjecture, but I think it comes out in their comments. In particular, how they quickly jump past the material of the video itself and into my voice or my character or some other thing tangential to the content. They seem to want it to be about me, and not about the film or my analysis. This says to me that harassment, at least for someone like me who can be assumed to not be a cis straight man based on how I present myself in my videos, is personal more than ideological for them. They aren't offended by what I have to say as much as the fact that I'm the one saying it. Granted, that is baked into how I collected the comments. I collected comments that were going after me, but they were almost always going after me for some sort of identity-based thing rather than for my statements. They could have called me a moron or an asshole or even something like a feminazi or a white knight or something of that sort, but instead it was repeatedly some sort of gender-based harassment. All in all, it makes me think that transphobic and misogynistic rhetoric is an excuse to avoid having to engage with ideas from people who they dislike, relying on a systemic imbalance to denigrate the worth of anything I say so that they don't have to evaluate the points on their own. This is epitomized best by this comment, which explicitly says that they were afraid that they would have to engage with a woman's ideas, and acknowledge that a woman can be smart, before realizing that I'm trans and, in their mind, not actually a woman by their standard. That's what the bigger picture suggests most of all, is that harassment on YouTube is not only pointed in particular directions, by which I mean marginalized people, but is also used as a means of avoiding engagement with anything that may challenge them. Maybe not a particularly big revelation, but it's still worth taking note of. So more than the bigger picture itself, I want to look at the particulars of these kinds of comments, not just trends between them, but individual instances of rhetoric and perspective, and really trace the relationship between the behaviors of harassment and the mentality that is inevitably implied by the behaviors. This isn't to say that I can read the minds of any particular harasser, but that by looking at the content they've provided me with, I can see what the role of harasser entails and the mindset that drives someone to fit that role. So let's look at some specific comments. First, I'll address the remarks about gender and sexuality. So this comment right here showcases two common talking points that the typical gender harassment would entail: the androgyny of my voice and hormones. They mention how their girlfriend thought I was a quote-unquote female based on my voice alone, and then appeals to a conspiracy theory by arguing that we've brainwashed the testosterone out of today's youth. I really want to address the feminized males conspiracy theory that is extremely prevalent among the rhetoric of harassers, because it's based on a combination of pseudoscience and patriarchal base assumptions, both of which are rather easy to debunk. First of all, men are not being feminized by a cabal of feminists in academia. This is just straight up paranoia, and it traces back all the way to the first wave of feminism, when women began taking on roles as teachers in the growing education system. Men at the time were fearful that this would lead to boys being raised to be women, and cultural tensions at the time surrounding the fear of the feminization of boys influenced the foundation of organizations like the Boy Scouts of America in retaliation, an attempt to instill a sense of masculinity and patriotism into young boys. A good 100 years later, and masculinity is still the norm for men, and most men are still men. But that anxiety that men can be feminized into being women showcases the flimsiness of the anti-trans arguments, because they have to simultaneously argue that manhood is an innate biological trait, but that it can also be deprived extremely easily by simply doing things like eating soy products or having a woman as a teacher. It's worth noting that these complaints of men being feminized and becoming women are incoherent and self-defeating, but also that it's a way of reinforcing gender normativity. The specific tie between masculinity and testosterone is also incoherent, and is an attempt to scientifically validate masculine norms. Now, it's worth noting that the relationship between masculinity and testosterone has been discussed in depth by many in academia from many angles, including angles that affirm that testosterone is what influences or even altogether creates masculinity in men. In my opinion, this is self-evidently false, or at the very least, very easy to complicate, given the way that people react to post-transition trans women. Trans women willingly take HRT to suppress their testosterone levels altogether and increase estrogen levels, and this makes trans women more likely to have the hormone levels of cis women, and will also look more feminized in a normative sense of the word. Trans women are still hypermasculinized by bigots despite this, and it goes as far as bigots arguing that trans women are sexually aggressive, as is evidenced by the controversy surrounding trans women using public restrooms. This is based on the idea that sexual aggression is a more masculine trait, and if testosterone levels were to dictate said masculine trait, then trans women would initially start out more inclined to sexual aggression, and then after transition would lower in sexual aggressiveness to match the same rates as cis women. Trans women, of course, statistically have very, very low rates of sexual assault, and in fact often have higher rates of being victims of sex crimes than most people. If masculinity were dictated by testosterone, then the stigma about trans women would be entirely invalidated by access to HRT. I'm going to link in the description a paper that argues in favor of the inverse, however, that gender norms impact testosterone levels. Hormones are malleable and reactive much of the time, and when we see stressors that lead to an increase in testosterone levels, such as competitiveness, we see that they coincide with normative constructions of masculinity, and people sort of retroactively ascribe all three things to some innate essence of manhood. When in fact, everyone has some level of testosterone, this can be easily manipulated, and testosterone level doesn't really say a lot about a person's behaviors or thoughts. If you feel that I might be wrong about any of this, feel free to let me know, but please bring citations to the table, otherwise I won't consider it. If anything, the discussion of testosterone in comments shows that, to a harasser, testosterone is symbolic of masculinity, even though I'd contend, as with the article that I linked, that testosterone isn't necessarily indicative of masculinity. But the feminized male myth is a common trope of anti-feminist and transphobic rhetoric, so it becomes a prominent feature of YouTube comments, unfortunately. Having addressed the issue, let's take a look at some more examples of it. Another guilt-ridden, testosterone-challenged Anglo-Saxon. Such left-wing anti-white bullshit. You sound like a faggot. Typical low-T loser new male. This one made me chuckle because I actually had no idea what a new male was and had to look it up, to which I found this description on the lovely source Urban Dictionary. New males are men, with men being used as loosely as possible, lacking self-respect, who are completely devoid of any masculinity and will jump at any moment to defend women online for feminist brownie points, while falsely believing that in return they'll receive sexual favors. They're a step above nice guys in terms of beta they are. This is just so dorky and sort of illuminating. It reminds me that a lot of these people digest large portions of their culture directly through the internet. Most people I know don't spend any time on social media or even have accounts on sites like YouTube. I try my best to keep up with what goes on online from a sociological perspective, but even then I'm indifferent to most of what goes on. I think it shows how isolated and distant these people and their logic can be from people who don't spend time in their circles. It reminds me of the term cuck, a term that was used to insult men, but never had even the slightest impact because the only people who would be offended by such an insinuation had to already regularly use the term themselves. So to an outside observer, it just sounded like absurd and immature nonsense. And that's a prominent feature of harassers and bigots, is that they can't engage with outsiders to their in-group without a loaded perspective, using pre-packaged insults as ammunition to avoid engagement with people they disrespect or disagree with. One of the most common pieces of rhetoric among harassers was arguing that trans people are mentally ill or that gender is biological. I've already addressed both of these arguments in my Debunking Transphobia video, which I'll link to in the description, but beyond just the arguments themselves, I want to discuss a little bit more about why people seem to be making these arguments, beyond just because they believe them. Certainly they do believe them, but belief is always informed by more than just reasoning and logic. It plays into a concept that I've been thinking about a lot recently, but that I didn't have a good name for. A follower on Twitter user Kalani, came up with the phrase externalized participation, which I thought was a perfect phrase to convey the idea, so all credit to them for coming up with it. Externalized participation is referring to this idea that a person can divorce themselves from the identity associated with a harmful ideology while still engaging in the harmful ideology. Sometimes this is intentional, other times it's pure obliviousness that leads to it. But regardless, the person externalizes the problem as the product of other people. In this case, people who do transphobic things become incapable of conceptualizing themselves as a harasser or a bigot because they've successfully divorced the act of transphobia from the concept of transphobia. Here's a great example. The first thing this person notes is that I have a mental issue. This, on its own, does not imply a motivation beyond the general umbrella of transphobic bigotry. But the person then goes on to say the exact motivation underlying their statement. The LGBT community, Hollywood, and the mainstream media push the narrative that this is a right which must be defended, rather than a mental disorder that deserves understanding and treatment. The instant labeling of any discourse which doesn't align with this narrative as phobia or hate speech serves only to slow our understanding of the issue. What I find so damning about this excuse is the instinct that it implies. It places the harasser in the position of three separate things: underdog, victim, and authority. They're an underdog in that they portray the system as working entirely against their beliefs about trans people. They're a victim in that they get labeled harsh words for their beliefs, and they're an authority in that they position their perspective as overriding that of not only the media at large, but also the entire LGBT community. This instinct is one in which they are the ones fighting for what is right, sacrificing, and being harmed by the issues at hand. Of course, this instinct is simply wrong. There are no statistics that demonstrate systemic oppression against cis people, while there are numerous statistics that demonstrate systemic oppression against trans people, of which I'll link some in the description. To me, this is clearly antagonistic, that their instinct is to speak for trans people rather than to listen to us. Certainly they won't listen to sociologists, psychologists, or biologists who have been stating for quite a while that trans people are not mentally ill and are the gender we say we are, because harassers don't actually care. What does seem to matter, based on the many comments I've seen, is that they want to control the narrative. This means that they have to find a way to make those who have conflicting narratives from them seem untrustworthy. The slight against the mainstream media, for example, is an attempt to make it so that the media can't be trusted to report properly on what exactly trans people are. Similarly, the accusations of mental illness help control the narrative by making trans people seem untrustworthy to handle ourselves. My best guess as to why they seek to harass people is that very idea of externalized participation. They genuinely believe in a transphobic ideology, but they've successfully externalized it. This comment, for example, willingly acknowledges that harassment and ridicule of trans people is wrong in the very same comment that they've called people who believe trans people are valid deluded. That is a direct example of ridicule, and yet this person can't conceptualize themselves as the harasser that they supposedly condemn. This is the harassment. It's an attempt to control the narrative without being held accountable for the ideology. It's just the facts, even though nothing they say is actually a fact that is relevant to the social construction of gender in society. It's a way of displacing the potential guilt that comes with being the one doing wrongful things. It's either trans people's own fault for existing, or the media's fault for promoting us, or the fault of nameless, faceless bigots who are not them, even though they say exactly the same things as the bigots they decry. This lack of accountability is reinforced by the nature of the medium and by systemic privilege. Because they're typically anonymous, it'll never reflect poorly on them directly, and the ideas will seem divorced of the person behind it. And because most people are already inclined to disbelieve trans people or to speak over us, a lot of people will instinctively believe the flawed reasoning that harassers give, because they won't realize that behind that flawed reasoning is a motive of trying to silence and bully trans people through intimidation and attempting to control the narrative about our lives and our existence. Here's another example that showcases what I'm talking about. To a casual observer, this comment may look balanced in that it recognizes the capacity to be wrong or harmful on any side of the conversation. But really what it's doing is externalizing transphobia as a label through basic concern trolling. The person calls for me to respect their opinion and then immediately argues that I'm ill and that I need to be cured. Obviously, you can't cure trans people because trans isn't a mental illness, and even so, mental illnesses can't be cured, only managed. Attempts to cure someone of their identity in such a way as conversion therapy, which is quite literally a form of torture that includes inducing psychological and even physical trauma in order to break someone's psyche so hard that they become disgusted with themselves and instinctively reject their own identity. But there's something even worse here, which is that beyond just being simply wrong and harmful, they portray their perspective as equally valid and as part of a balanced debate of ideas. Obviously, if they portray themselves as healthy in contrast to me being mentally ill, that can't be a balanced debate, because the well has already been poisoned. But then they go a step further by arguing that we both advocate for violence in certain contexts. I find this absurd because at no point did I argue in favor of violence in my Debunking Transphobia video, and I don't believe I've done so in any video. I especially have never argued in favor of violence towards transphobic bigots, which is the topic at hand, so that backhanded accusation is particularly gross. They then argue that these issues are literally life or death for both sides, which is a gross exaggeration. It is life or death for trans people who have been murdered due to hate crimes, bullied and even tortured into suicide, and discriminated against so heavily that we've experienced systemic neglect that causes many preventable deaths, including things like the AIDS crisis and high suicide rates due to a lack of cracking down on discrimination against us. There is no life or death consequence for transphobic bigots who experience no systemic discrimination and have never been put in serious harm's way by espousing such rhetoric. They then end by trying to portray discussing tranny and hateful bigot as equally harmful words when they most definitely are not. This whole both sides idea creates a situation in which trans people are somehow both mentally ill and bullies of those who acknowledge this supposed fact. It's hiding behind privilege by poisoning the well for those who lack that privilege so that we are no longer capable of speaking on our own behalf, which allows them the opportunity to dictate to us who we are and how we experience life. Who we are, to them, are deluded people who need to be somehow cured, which is a gross misrepresentation of trans experiences and mental illness. But since there is also a stigma against mental illness, it creates an extremely one-sided conversation. This attempt to portray themselves as somehow victims in what is effectively an act of intimidation on their part is really just a convenient way to erase the one-sidedness to an observer's perspective by making trans people's refusals to be harassed and stigmatized come across as its own form of violence against the harassers. Now let's move on to another type of comment, the racist and anti-Semitic comments. I wanted to differentiate these comments for a reason. Being that I'm white and not affected by racism or anti-Semitism, the racist and anti-Semitic comments are completely irrelevant, and it shows a remarkable shittiness that they can leap not only past the conversation at hand, but even past myself and into territory that has no relevance to my channel at all, just to be awful people to marginalized groups. One of the major features of racist and anti-Semitic harassment was insinuations of white guilt on my part. This is just utter bullshit. I honestly have no reason to engage with the kind of garbage personalities that would say such things, but this video isn't so much about engagement as it is about documenting the phenomenon and trying to make sense of it, so I will address it. White guilt can refer to two things. There's the racist rhetorical strawman version of white guilt, and then the actual issue of white people guilt-tripping people of color over our own ability to handle our racist tendencies. The second of those two things is when white people force people of color to expend emotional labor coddling us because we can't cope with the fact that we contribute to racism in the world via our systemic privilege. We become guilt-ridden and toxic, and it's our responsibility to not let this be a thing, because it is, in and of itself, an act of racism against people of color, because it's basically a passive-aggressive way of blaming people of color for calling us out on our racist tendencies. This has never been something that I've done on my channel. I've never made any discussion of race in any of my videos be about myself or my own feelings of guilt over my place in systemic racism. We live in a pretty bad scenario, and my hope would always be to make life better for those around me, regardless of race or ethnicity. And I recognize that part of doing that is moving past ideas of guilt and toward the ideas of how we can make things better moving forward. The straw man version of white guilt, the one that commenters are actually referring to, is this idea that any white person who is even remotely willing to recognize the systemic violence and discrimination that white people enact against people of color is brainwashed by social justice advocates. The implication of white guilt for them is that it's a way of shaming white people and falsely pinning the effects of racism onto white people. They're saying that by mentioning themes of racism in something like The Shining, I am somehow guilt-tripping white people for something they haven't done. The first thing to establish, of course, is that historically, statistically, economically, culturally, and politically, white people have enacted domination and oppression against people of color. By all accounts, racism benefits white people at the expense of everyone else. Second is that white guilt is sort of a Nazi dog whistle, as is the inverse concept of white pride. Third is that it's a silencing tactic. By saying I have white guilt, they try to discredit anything that I say if I try to speak out against racism. Again, harassers often try to prevent a conversation from happening, and so they try to create a power dynamic in which only they can be trusted on any topic. And to show transparency, to make sure I'm not inadvertently doing the same thing, I am addressing the conversation on their side of the court in addition to my own perspective. I've addressed the conversations about white guilt and trans being a mental illness and these sorts of things within this video so far, and they're repeatedly based on debunked claims, conspiratorial logic, or downright non sequiturs. Speaking of which, the anti-Semitism is particularly concerning in that it showcases a deeper, darker undercurrent of social media, which is the rise in overt Nazi sympathies. The most obvious example would be the alt-right movement, but these kinds of folks have been around for quite a time before the alt-right movement gained traction. Unlike race conversations, with which harassers will typically skirt around accusations of racism or leave things implied, or try to reframe things to make it harder to call them out, anti-Semitic harassment, at least the kind I've seen in my videos, is overt and proudly disgusting. These guys help to make clearer the blurred line between a just asking questions type troll and a full-on Nazi, and I'm honestly a bit thankful that they only show up in relatively low numbers on my videos. What I find different here is that there's next to no attempt to justify, validate, or even complicate their position. There's no pretense of trying to poison the well for me as an individual, and instead they just go directly to anti-Semitic remarks with no self-censorship. It's hard to even react to because I'm just so disgusted by how little empathy these people even have. They already deprive themselves of dignity, so I don't really think I should dignify them by critiquing them as if they have anything meaningful to say. But it should go without saying that Zionist conspiracies are nonsense, Jewish people don't deserve such contempt, and if you say this kind of awful shit on my videos, you are not fucking welcome to watch them, so piss off. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and highlight certain comments because I got a lot of comments harassing me in a sort of blanket way, but as I was making my channel, I saw sort of a, dip in the amount of quality with certain comments where each new comment would be more ridiculous than the last in terms of like what they said and what they were trying to get across. So for this next bit, I'm gonna highlight some of my favorite comments, the ones that are sort of like golden nuggets of tone deafness and hilarity. These are the kinds of comments that I wish I could just like laminate on my bedroom wall and just preserve it for all of time, basically. So let's go ahead and check out some of those. Oh, thank goodness. I was worried of the notion that a girl could produce such a ... analytical video about a show with symbolic themes until I realized you were dragging. Phew, now I feel validated after this well-needed confirmation. This comment is the textbook definition of an asshole. Malmrose is anti-feminist Trump supporter who hates women. Malmrose voted for Trump. Malmrose is a MGTOW who hates women. Malmrose is anti-feminist and hates women. Okay, I love this one because they're trying to, like, basically do a smear campaign in the form of YouTube comments. And, like, clearly they don't know me much at all because they're using my screen name, which is just my last name. And second of all, like, anti-feminist Trump supporter, all of my videos are complained about being too feminist. So it's like, it's a no-win scenario. Apparently, if I talk about feminism, I'm both a feminist SJW and I'm somehow a MGTOW anti-feminist Trump supporter. Like, that's ridiculous. Also, fuck Trump. He's an asshole. Okay, so here's the stuff that I really love where they just, like, almost go to a next level of just, like, mix of conspiracy theory and laziness and just, like, complete inability, like, no self-awareness at all. It's a losing game for your kind. Nobody believes you and you theories. They are fucking corrupted and you're just bunch damn lunatics. People are fed with you. Just look at the number of views on your pathetic channel and compare it to the Sargons or Jordan Petersons. Okay, so here's the thing. Repeatedly, people bring up Sargon of Akkad in my comments, and Sargon is a dipshit. He's a fucking Pillsbury Doughboy of a man. Like, I don't have any interest in what Sargon has to say. I don't care how much money he makes or how many subscribers he has. My videos aren't about trying to get the most subscribers, and they're not about trying to get the most views. I'm just doing stuff that is important to me. And, like, Jordan Peterson is my favorite example of the, like, intellectual masculinity of the skeptic community, because, like, okay, so the skeptics are science, right? That's their big thing. They're scientific skeptics. They reject religion, they reject atheism, they reject Christianity and Christian apologetics, right? And now they're supporting Jordan Peterson because he said, I'm not going to respect they, them pronouns, even though he's already inadvertently done so. And, like, okay, so it's just so fucking weird that they would support Jordan Peterson, who admitted to being a presuppositional Christian apologist. As in, these guys who worship themselves as beacons of thought and reason are supporting a guy who said that if you do not believe in Christianity, you are literally insane. That's something that Jordan Peterson believes. And Sargon of Akkad is a crypto-Nazi and a fucking 9/11 truther. And when I joined the skeptic community when I was younger, I joined them because of 9/11 truth debunking, as in saying that 9/11 truth was bullshit and that the official account is the accurate account. And now their main guys that they support are a presuppositional Christian and a 9/11 truther. Just let that sink in. It's fucking ridiculous. Abusive husbands do not exist. They are made up by feminists. She is the cause of all the problems in his life and drives him crazy with her psychotic mind. Women are the cause of all problems in the world. Love to lie and twist everything up. I'm just gonna say it. You're projecting a little, dude. You're not being marginalized. You're less than 1% of the population. What does he think marginalization is? Here's a piece of advice. when analyzing a movie, do not tell people what you think about right or wrong. We didn't come here to hear that crap. You have some ideas of what is right or wrong in the realm of sexism, racism, abuse, and gender roles, and then take it upon yourself to dictate to the world your way should be their way. Well, fuck you! What the fuck do you know about anything, and who gives you permission to give yourself such a stance? You sound like a guy who's been castrated and believes all the political correct BS that's on the media these days. But I don't think you're a guy. You sound like a gay guy. So you have no understanding of men and their roles at all. I'm not white, but it's easy for me to see why whites are generally superior to, say, blacks. There are exceptions, of course, but that's what they are, exceptions. Okay, so, first of all, the fucking white nationalist propaganda, get the fuck out of here. I don't want you on my channel. Second of all, I don't think you are a guy. You sound like a gay guy, so you have no understanding of men and their roles at all. Like, okay, so I am simultaneously not a man, and I'm a gay man, and I have no understanding of men because I'm a gay man? That's, like, it's, like, what am I supposed to do with that? It's, like, gay men are men. They know what it means to be a man. They understand masculine roles. Like, a lot of gay men, especially gay men that I know, are, like, not very feminine. Like, it's not a thing. Like, sure, my voice is androgynous, but that doesn't say anything about my character. But, like, the fact that he can, like, jump from, you're wrong, to you're castrated, to you're not a man, to you are a man, to racism is just indicative of the bigger, like, picture of how fucking absurd the harassment is on YouTube. Okay, so this one is on my skeptic video, the one where I talk about suits, and how they're all about, like, trying to be badass. Like, they're all trying to be masculine, and they're trying to project. So here's the remark. Wrong. Suits are badass. Consider your question solved. You know, I should have done a different version of that video that's just 3 seconds long, and it's just me staring at the camera saying, "Suits are badass." Like, okay, who the fuck? Like, suits aren't badass. They're fucking dorky or classy if you really want to get into it. Like, it's not something that you should sort of tout as, like, a sign of how manly you are, especially when you're doing it via an avatar with a suit. Like, it's not even your suit. It's not even you wearing the suit. It's a picture of a fucking gopher with a fucking suit on that's not as badass as you might think it is. Sorry, 20-year-old's point of view holds no weight from lack of experience. I was with you until you brought your political opinions to what I believed was a movie review. Calling Muslims a race. The social interactions of the past were more open and forgiving between men. Now we are expected to be women. Be nice. Don't use bad words. The world was built by guys that ran over your little gentle asses, and we always will. No woman wants to breed with a weak, spineless man. You will learn this eventually. Like, okay, so, first of all, that avatar is telling. Second of all, now we are expected to be women. That's not a thing. Be nice, don't use bad words, as though that's something that, like, makes you womanly. Is like, oh, I should care about other people. Fuck that, I'm manly. And it's like, and then built by guys that ran over your little gentle asses. Like, thanks for at least acknowledging that my ass is gentle. I really appreciate that. But, like, no one wants to breed with a weak spineless man. Okay, this is my favorite comment, because the like, insecurities that come out in just that one sentence is so great, because, like, the obsession with the idea that we're trying to get laid, that's not something that is true of me, and it's not something that's true of someone who is, you know, not even a man, but it's, like, furthermore, like, that's not even true of men. Like, not all men want to breed. That's not the fucking goal of being a man, is to have sex with women. This is, like, really, like, the red pill community and men's rights activists and these guys who sort of constructed masculinity around nerd culture basically operate like a cult. And they think that everyone thinks like them, really, and so they insinuate that we really do, and then they project that, which really just reveals more about themselves than it says about us, because what it's basically doing is it's showing that their main concern is they want to have sex with women, and it's like, okay, I know a lot of women. I've had sex with women before. You want to know what women don't like? They don't like guys who obsess about their masculinity like that. Okay, this one's great. I'm a cis white male, and my theory on all of this is that you're mentally ill. The cause of your illness, an extremely chemically polluted estrogenized environment butt fucking you at some point of your development. You, like every other atrocity in this world, is man-made and a sign of the end. Don't worry your sweet little head about it, though. You've been through enough. Just train your little sissy hole for me and do reviews on Half-Life design and other stupid gay shit. Oh my god, like, estrogenized environment. Like, men are gonna lose. Like, I think men are gonna die off because, the trans is airborne. Do you not realize that ideologies change over time? And since anti-feminism is tied directly to feminism, it's certain that anti-feminism will change as feminism changes. Yes, anti-feminists 100 years ago were mostly sexist and misogynists, but now, ever since the start of the third wave, feminism has become less and less about equality and more about maintaining a victim complex and using any reason, logical or not, to justify this. That's not true. So now, inversely, anti-feminism has grown to include not just the people I mentioned before, but also rationalists who can see through the thin veneer of equality to see what feminism is trying to do. But if you don't believe me, I challenge you. Watch every single video that Sargon of Akkad has ever made and tell me if he has ever said anything sexist. And I mean an actually sexist thing, not a statistic, not a joke, something that a normal person would look at and say, yeah, that's sexist. Okay, so for my viewers watching, I present to you the Sargon of Akkad challenge. Watch any video of Sargon's and try to make it as far as you can before hearing something sexist or misogynist, and then stop the video and record your time and then let me know, because the fact that he thinks I'm going to watch every Sargon of Akkad video looking for a single sexist thing is way too forgiving and way too lenient to Sargon of Akkad, the man who threatened a rape survivor with rape. Fuck Sargon and fuck this comment. This was really good until you started into your white-hating leftist political bullshit, but I could have guessed you would have. After all, you are a little beta male pajama boy with your lisp and your high, fruity, girly voice, and your smug little attitude. I can just imagine you walking all swishy and doing that little hand flip that you fags do when you talk. I was even going to subscribe to your channel, but not now. Go to hell. Oh my god, this is, oh, I'm broken. I'm broken. I just need to put on my little beta male pajamas and go do that little hand flip to vent out all of this anxiety about this horrible comment. He was gonna subscribe! I lost my most important subscriber. And just as a side note, his profile picture is a Viking holding a beer. I love my harassers. Please, send more. I need more comments like this, please. They make my day. Alright, so here's the last comment, and I saved my favorite for last, because this is the one that struck me the hardest when I first read it, and people I've shown it to have just burst into laughter hearing it, so here goes. You're a true SJW pink pussy hat wearing mofo who probably has a 4-inch dick and thinks if he boosts feminism he will get laid. I'm tired of you geeks selling out manhood because you were too bitch to make the cut. Shaking my head. Good analysis though for the movie. I've read this comment like 50 times and I'm still taken aback that that was a positive review. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I've been harassed. You win. I apparently I have a small dick, and I'm a man, and I'm a white knight, and I'm an SJW, and I'm a tranny, and I'm a faggot, and apparently after all of this stuff, at least I make good videos, so I guess I win this round. The reason I made this video is because I know people who have an interest in making videos on YouTube, but for some reason or another, a lot of them never got around to doing it. Of those people, at least a few of them have cited potential harassment as a reason to avoid making content. The fear is very real, so I was hoping to provide a counterpoint, a video that shows what the harassment looks like, how much of it there is, what is really happening when the harassment occurs, and also what we can do about it. I want to hopefully show that, yeah, the harassment can be pretty bad, but they're effectively powerless. Clearly, these types of commenters want to control the conversation in some way. They want to prevent the voices of marginalized folks from being heard. But the harassment is a particular type of lazy, easy bigotry that gets nothing done. During this video, I mentioned how the conversation is a bit one-sided, but the inverse is actually true. Even though they have a lot of privilege to their advantage and try to use my status as a trans person against me, I actually have a lot more power in the dynamic than they do, because their comments are a response to my videos, so I have the luxury of ignoring them and it won't affect me in any way. But their interactions, either positive or negative, will affect YouTube algorithms in such a way that my videos are more likely to be seen, which means I'm more likely to develop an audience. They can try to dogpile or downvote my videos, but effectively, they do nothing to me unless I choose to engage with them. Most of the time, I don't. The goal, of course, is to have a situation in which none of us have to concern ourselves with the possibility of harassment. A situation in which harassment doesn't happen, or happens to such a minor degree that it becomes nearly unnoticeable. We shouldn't have to be afraid of harassment. It's one of those things where, despite being relatively uncommon, it happens enough and with such a grossness to it that it creates a barrier to entry for marginalized folks. The important issues here are that people are allowed to get away with harassment, and it can at any moment get severely more stressful, as seen with the abuse that Anita Sarkeesian received during the course of her Tropes vs. Women in video game series. More importantly, those who deal with harassment are often left to fight it on their own. The answer is always what we as individuals can do to prevent the harassment we individually receive. I do think there's more that can be done about it. The most obvious, but also most difficult to manage, is pushing social media sites that have a lower tolerance for harassment, particularly harassment that incites hate speech or threats against marginalized people. This issue is often ignored by social media sites altogether and has become a bit of a meme on Twitter in particular, but I find it most prevalent on YouTube myself. Something I think that might be a bit easier is support networks. Content creators of various sizes creating an inclusive collective that can help to highlight gross harassment that people face, as well as potentially prevent dogpiling or bullying from bigger YouTubers, and maybe help provoke YouTube to step in more. Just some way of making sure that the barrier to entry for unheard channels is lessened in some way. It could also be promotion of smaller channels to counteract the indifference that larger audiences have towards the harassment that does go on. I also think another possible option is to highlight the tactics of harassers and the ideology of said harassment and work against those things in a more big picture sense. Innuendo Studios is currently doing a series on the alt-right entitled The Alt-Right Playbook that does this, and I love this series so far and definitely think that it plays into the kinds of comments that I featured in this video, and I definitely recommend it. My personal goal is to give people tools to use when navigating the kinds of issues that I bring up in my videos. So if I were to offer my perspective, I think the biggest thing is to recognize the power imbalance that comes from a harasser's attempts to shut down the conversation or maintain the conversation on their own terms. Since this is typically done in a marginalizing manner, such as transphobic people trying to keep the conversation focused on the idea that trans people are mentally ill, we need to be mindful of not only counterpoints, but ways of denying them their opportunities to spread bad information and hateful rhetoric. Everyone is going to approach that differently, and I don't think any approach is wrong necessarily. Some people won't allow comments altogether from harassers to prevent them getting exposure. Others will respond and engage their arguments, while others still might just ridicule them. My approach in comments is to only talk with people who aren't harassers or to mess around with harassers who are particularly pathetic. My general approach, however, is what I did in this video, which is documenting common threads among the harassers and letting that inform where I go stepping forward, as well as highlighting the problems with what they have to say in a way that takes away their power to control the conversation. Hopefully I gave an accurate picture of what it looks like when a YouTuber with my viewer base gets caught in the line of fire of internet trolls, and hopefully there's something to take away from this video for those who either don't experience this kind of harassment or who haven't yet made the leap to content creation on YouTube. My goal with this channel is to use viewer support to help fund college expenses while I'm on track to hopefully get a PhD in sociology someday and teach sociology courses for a living. If you'd like to support the channel or my goals for the channel, please feel free to donate to my Patreon. All generosity is welcome, but not required, and I'll always be available on Twitter if you'd like to follow me there. That's probably the best place to reach me. Thanks for watching.